Hey, what's up? Andrew Kramer here, and welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today, we're going to take a look at putting Sam Loya on the surface of some alien planet, possibly some place where he'll feel much more comfortable with the locals. So let's take a look at what we're going to be creating. All right, so walking up here. Perfect. High-tech device. And there he is. Okay, so there's a few things to talk about here. So first we have Sam Loya just walking out, and he's got the paintball mask on. You know, we really try to put a lot of production value into these little shoots. And we needed a screen, so we just took one off the Epic camera. Perfect. And by the way, this interface, take an old Windows interface, tint it blue, and bam, future. So one of the things to talk about here, how do you create establishing shots that create a cool world? So in this case, we just have this housing development track, and it has a lot of flat surface, but the background's not quite as alien. So we were able to just replace the background with some matte painting and some rocks on the ground. All right, let's go and take a look at putting this shot together. So we've got Sam standing outside here, and we'll drop that into a new comp. And first thing we need to do is track the shot. So we can use the built-in camera tracker in AECS6. Now, a few people have asked me, how does the camera tracker plugin from the Foundry compare to the track camera tool inside After Effects CS6? And the bottom line is the built-in one in CS6 is pretty good. It works usually in cases where there's not a lot of motion blur and there's not a lot of animation or movement on the frame. However, the camera tracker plugin has a lot of other more advanced options. So let's say you try using the built-in one and you're not getting a good track, then you might consider the camera tracker plugin because it has options to matte out animated stuff, so if Sam was moving a lot, we can matte him out and track the shot without him. There's also options to change, the tracking, how many features, the distance. So it just has some better options to get a more refined track under trickier circumstances. But the built-in camera tracker is nice because it actually comes with CS6. So if you don't do a lot of 3D tracking, it's really great to have it built into the core application. So that's definitely something fun to have. All right, so this is going to track the shot here with Sam Loya. All right, so now we have our 3D tracking data. So what we need to do is create a 3D camera. So I'm going to find a place in the tracking data that is fairly flat and that represents this flat surface. So maybe here we'll click, right click, and choose Create Null and Camera. So now if I hit the tilde key, we can see we have a tracking point and we also have a camera. So if we look at that point, it stays locked to the surface. So let's go and make a few more points that we can reference when we build up this background. So we'll take a few from far away here. Maybe this one, right click, create null. Maybe over here, right click, create null. And maybe one over here, create null. And we created one over here. Let's just create another one over here, create null. So I want to try to create as many nulls as I think I will need before I move on to the next few steps. Now, if you've watched a few of the last tutorials, you know that tracking is a bit repetitive and it's a lot of the same stuff, but it's a really important thing to get good at because you want your visual effects to look like they're integrated into your shot. And a 3D camera track is sort of the best way to be able to put things in 3D space and make them look like they're really attached to the world. All right, so now we have our 3D nulls, but I like to normalize my scene because right now, if I were to create a 3D layer and put it into my scene, it would just be floating in a weird place. So I like to normalize everything so that it's a little easier to work with. So we'll create a null object, make it 3D, and the way After Effects works is it puts the null object in the middle of our scene. So what I want to do is take all of the track data and the 3D camera, hold down Shift, and parent it to my 3D null. And so now if I move this around, I can actually resize and reposition all of our tracking data. So let me show you what I mean. So let's go to the top view And there's our null object, and that's the center of our scene, but our points are really far away. So we have some over here. If I select them, we can see them a little bit better. They're all over the place. So what I want to do is take our null object and scale it down, hit S, and we'll scale it down to about 10. So we've essentially shrunk the world down. But if I go back to the active camera, let's take this point right here. Let's say I want that to be the center of the world. So while it's selected, I'm going to go back to the top view, and it's that null object right there. So that's the one that's selected. And what I want to do is keep my eye on that. So we'll take our middle null object, and let's scale the world down even more, maybe down to 5%. And again, that's the null object we want to move. So if we take our null object here, we move it down, that null object, that first null object that's right here, is starting to get closer to the center of the world. So if we hit the title safe here, we turn that on, we can see a little cross that will allow us to line that up perfectly. So we'll move it here, slide it down, there we go. So now that's in the center. But what about in the front view? So if we go back to the active camera, we can see that all of our null objects still line up perfectly with our camera. So we haven't changed the relative position, we've just shrunk it down a little bit. So let's go to the front view now, and let's see if we can flatten these out. So we'll take that same null object, and we're gonna rotate it. So we'll hit R. Now the points are pretty small, and I want you guys to be able to see this. So I'm gonna scale these up, hit S, scale them up a bit. So there they are, all across the frame. And what I want to do is rotate them until they're flat. So let's see here. X rotation, check this out. If I hit Control R, I can bring a guide down. And look at this. We want to be looking at the tops of all these null objects. It's pretty close to being flat. So we can rotate this a bit, maybe get them to line up as good as possible. So the next thing we want to do is take that first null, which is right here, and make sure it again is in the center. So we'll take our new null object, the one we created that parented all of the layers together, and move this up. So now you can see that first null is almost right in the center. So let's move this up a little bit more and slide it over. All right, so we'll get rid of the guide. So now let's go back to the active camera, and we have all of our null objects are still in the scene. Everything is locked down just how we want it to be. So now let's do that thing where we create some text, make it 3D, and let's see how this looks. So that looks a little bit better. We're actually getting a little bit of surface interaction, and it starts to look like it's touching the ground where we want it. And that's because we've normalized our scene and set it up so that it's flat. All right, so let's go and delete that. Now, I know it's a little bit annoying to set this up every time, but it really makes a big difference. So now we can take that original null and just delete it, and everything is still good to go. All right, so the next thing we want to do is composite our matte painting into the background. So a couple of months ago, we did this little matte painting challenge where we posted this still, and a bunch of people submitted in their matte paintings. And let me just tell you, it was the most amazing thing ever. There must have been, 500, probably more entries on the forum. And people just took this image and started compositing it together and creating really cool backgrounds. And I want to thank everyone who spent the time creating the matte painting, and we're definitely going to do more of this stuff in the future because it was seriously inspirational to see how many people downloaded it, worked on it for hours and hours, and so thank you very much. We're actually taking a matte painting by a gentleman named Marco, who put together this matte painting, which has some cool mountains and this sort of vast alien background. And what I did is I went into Photoshop and separated out the layers. So we have the background, and then we have the mountains, and that'll just help us composite this a little bit better. So here we go. We've got our 3D layer, so let's take this matte painting and drop it in over top our footage. We'll make it a 3D layer. And we want to move the position of the layer to be further away. So if we take one of the further away null objects like this one, hit P, and we can copy the position. So we could choose Edit, Copy, and then click on the matte painting and choose Edit, Paste. So now it's a little bit further away, and then we can maybe scale this up, rotate it a little bit here, and then even push it back further in 3D space. So the reality is we don't actually need to do this entire piece. We only need a little bit of it. So we need to create a 3D mask to sort of mask out the bottom of the frame. So we could just take, you know, the mask tool and create a subtraction mask. The only problem with that is it may not line up as perfectly as we want. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to shut that off. We're going to create a new solid. So we'll just do new solid, maybe make it 1920 by 1920, so it's a square, and we'll hit OK. And we'll make it a 3D layer. We'll rotate it so that it's flat. And then we're going to go to the ellipse tool and double click on it. So that makes a perfect ellipse. And then we're going to scale it up and then hit MM. And we're going to go into the mask properties. So what we can do is we can bring the expansion in, and that'll sort of shrink it out. And then we can turn the feathering amount up. So we're creating this sort of 3D feathered mask. And then we'll take this, put it above the matte painting, hit F4, and set it as the alpha inverted matte. Turn it back on. So now we're starting to get somewhere, almost. We can take this and hit MM, and we can expand the mask. And that allows us to, you know, refine it perfectly into our shot, add more feathering so that it looks like it blends nicely. And so that's looking pretty good. The other thing we need to do is color correct our shot. What I'm going to do is just take our footage and try to match it. So we'll do color correction tint and color correction curves. So let's see here. We'll bring the tint amount down to about 20 there. And go to the red channel, bring the red out of it, and punch up the blue a little bit. So something like that, maybe a little more like a little darker. Yeah. So that's not too bad. We could, you know, we can refine it a little bit later. But one of the things we're running into is our background plate is sort of running out of space. It's not large enough. So what we can do is we can try to move it over. We can even try to split it up. So here's something that we might try. Let's take it and take the rectangle tool here, and let's like cut it in half. So maybe just cut it in half right here. Duplicate it, Control D. Actually, we'll duplicate the mask as well, Control D. And then we'll take that mask layer, hit M, and subtract it. So now we've created the opposite side of this mask. And then we can rotate it here. And, you know, we want to make sure that they line up. So let's go to the top view here. And that's about where we've cut them off. So this one cuts off here, and this one cuts off. See. Yeah, we want to go ahead and move this one about here so that they connect pretty close. Go back to the active camera. So then we just want to be careful about the seam. We want to make sure that they line up properly, because right now, you know, there might be a little bit of an edge. Now, we could even do a quick feather. So if we take them, hit F, maybe feather it like 100 pixels, and then overlap them a little bit. So check this out. If this is 100 pixels, and this is 100 pixels, we just need to overlap this one a little bit. And then maybe move it forward so that it's in front of it. All right, so maybe a little bit of a seam. We can maybe take one of them and maybe just don't have a feather on one of them, and then expand its mask. All right, so we have a little bit of a seam down here at the bottom, so let's just feather that back to like 20. And there we go. So that 25 seems to clean that up good. All right. Shut those off. And now our layers are back in full quality. There we go. And we have, a pretty three-dimensional matte painting. We could, color correct these tones a little bit better, maybe add another tint on top of it. All right, so we have a pretty good background here, and it didn't take that much time because we offloaded the time to the website and someone else did the work. So I'm just sitting here throwing it into 3D Space, and really I've done very little work here. So it's kind of tutorials I like, in fact. So we've got the disappearing head here. That's no problem. We can duplicate this, put the footage back on top, and then we just need to probably roto out his head. So we can, we could do some masks here and, add it back into the shot. We'd have to animate this a bit. The other thing we could do is we can use the Roto Brush tool. Now, this is like a really tough situation to use it on because the tones are all very similar. But let me just show you how that works and how you might be able to save some time with it. So let's go up here to the Roto Brush and click on that, and then double click on our clip. And then what we can do is zoom in here, and we can just start painting around, the main parts of Sam. And so now it creates a bit of a mask, and we don't need this to be perfect. You can hold down Control and then drag with your mouse to change the size. And if we hold down Alt, we can subtract areas. So you can see why it's a little tricky because some of these colors are very similar. And then we're going to use page up and page down. So let's talk about this area here. So right now we're in the middle of the comp. And you can see that these arrows go to the left and these arrows go to the right. So what I'm going to do is just move forward one frame at a time. Now, we can move forward a few at a time. We can say move forward 5. And you can see how this is kind of missing his eye. So instead of moving 5 at a time, what I'm going to do is just move a couple at a time. So we'll add the eye back in, make sure that that gets added in. And so the frames that come after it will actually contain those parts that accidentally get popped out. So just, and again, this is a really bad case for the Roto Brush, and yet it's still going to save us a little bit of time. So here we go. That highlight got lost. I was kind of clicking back and forth. I've been able to use the Roto Brush to save me so many times from having to do a ton of work. So it's really a cool tool. So I'll go ahead and go through the rest of the frames and just make sure that they look pretty good. All right, so this is looking pretty good, and what we want to do now is freeze it. So if we hit freeze, it'll process all of the frames so that it's not as slow to render while you're working. And you might even want to render out the matte as a separate element so you don't even have to wait for it to process, but this is probably going to work okay. So check this out. We've added the head back in. So we've taken just a piece of Sam and put him back on top of the plate. And then we have access to these cool Roto Brush options. So we can do things like smooth out the matte edges. We can feather it a little bit. And we can even choke Sam out here. We can choke the life out of him here and also shrink the matte. So it's pretty cool. There's also a refine matte option, which does some cool things to clean stuff up. Motion blur if your shot kind of moves pretty fast. All right, so let's go and take a look. So Sam's checking things out here, and this isn't too bad. Now, if we wanted to spend some more time, we could take the top layer and take the mountains and leave them where they're at, and then take the background and push it even further away in 3D Space. So you could really create a more dynamic shot where that stuff is actually further away in the background. Now, because this is a separate layer, we can even do things like bring the layer down a little bit lower and, sort of reposition where we want that sunset to be. All right, so you can really do a lot with this simple technique to transform your video and, just create a whole new location, to kind of talk about a few of these other parts. We had Sam walking by here, and let's see, where's our final shot? What's this, Windows 95? No. In the opening shot here, Sam's walking across this sort of wide-looking shot. And because it's such a wide shot, you can't tell that he's actually wearing a gas mask instead of the paintball mask. Well, we lost it, What are you going to do? We just had to change the movie. All right, let's go and see if we can squeeze a couple more tips into this tutorial. So one of the things I did was add a bunch of rocks into 3D space. So if we take a look at our shot here, what we could do is we could take some images of rocks and place them in 3D space and do all that stuff. But what I did is I used our new plugin Element 3D to reposition these rocks in the shot. Let me show you how I set that up. So I create a new solid, comp size, and we'll take Element, drop it on there, and we'll come over here, open up the scene setup. Now, one of the cool things is Element comes with a starter pack of models. So everyone who purchases the plugin has access to these. There's a planet, and there's these cool rocks that also are included. So we can click on the rocks, and they could be used as an asteroid or a meteor. And we're going to click on all three of them. So we have these three different looking rocks. Now, the way Element works is we have these group channels. So right now, they're all on group 1. And that's where we want them to be, because what we're going to do is create a random field of rocks. So let's go and hit OK. And so now we have a 3D rock that's in our scene. It's kind of strange, but there it is. So then we'll go to group 1, go to the particle replicator, and let's set the count up to, say, 200. So now what I want to do is change the replicator shape from a point to a plane. So now if I go to the XY scale, let's see, we could just scale it up here and maybe size the particles down. So go to the particle look, bring the size down. So now we have a bunch of rocks that are scattered around. Now this doesn't look very realistic. It kind of looks like a crop of rocks. Let's see if we can change that a bit. So if we go to the particle look, we can go to rotation and turn up the random rotation. So that's helping a bit. We can even turn up random size, so we can turn that up. Looks good. Change the size up. And lastly, we want to scatter them around more randomly. So if we come back up to the particle replicator, now instead of just scattering them in 3D space, we're going to go to the scatter XYZ. And here we can scatter them. Instead of on the y-axis, we can scatter them on the x and z-axis. So this makes it a lot more random. Then we can turn up the size of the surface, possibly turn up the particle count. And now we have, rocks sort of all over the ground. But we want them to look like they're a little bit more integrated. So let's add some quick color correction. So we'll go to the red channel, bring this down a bit, the blue channel, and possibly just, match them into the shot a bit. But the other thing we need to do is make it look like they're actually on the ground. So there's a really cool feature inside of Element 3D called the matte shadow object. So if we click on the scene setup again, and we can come over here to the primitives, and there's an object down here called a plane. And what we want to do is put this onto group number 2. So we'll uncheck it from group 1, it's only on group 2, and we'll hit OK. So what I'm going to do is scale this up. So we'll go to the particle look, turn the size up so it's nice and large. So now we can see the rocks are actually being cut off by the surface. So if I shut it off here, we see that that plane is sort of cutting off the bottom of the rocks. And we could even go to group 1 and maybe move the position of the rocks up a little bit higher. So we can actually adjust how much they intersect. But more importantly, we want to cut them off and actually see through that surface. So we'll go to the scene setup again and click on the material, and instead of a blue material, scroll down to the very bottom and turn on matte shadow. So now that object disappears and it says matte shadow material enabled. So we'll hit OK. And so now the background is transparent. So if we go to group 2 and shut the particle off, you can see that when it's turned on, it cuts the bottom of the rocks off. But what's more is now we can go to the render settings and turn on our screen space ambient occlusion. And so what this does is gives us a little bit of shading around the area of the rocks and starts to look like it's a little more integrated. And we could take a look at a couple more advanced options. If we turn up the cutoff, it'll make it so that the ambient occlusion is a little tighter around the areas of the rock and just a little bit more realistic that way. Of course, we have to deal with Sam, kind of in the way there. We just need to roto out Sam again. So the easy way might be just to take Sam's clip, duplicate it again, put it above the element, and then grab some of Sam here and hit M and just, try to mask out that area, And you just want to be careful. If you're going to cut off any of the rocks, make sure you cut them off the whole time. But, we kind of already talked about the roto brush. So I won't cover that too much right now. But this is the basic idea. Then we could go back into the element layer and we could do large rocks. We could do less rocks. Just have a couple of them kind of scattered around. And another really important thing is we want to match the blur level and maybe match the grain. So our plate is pretty soft, and let's just take the element layer and maybe add a little bit of a blur to it. So a fast blur of maybe 1 pixel really helps to, integrate that into a plate that's, fairly soft. This is definitely a more subtle use of element. It's just a small thing, but, it can make a big difference used in the right way. So anyway, my name is Andrew Kramer. Thank you guys for watching the tutorial. We will see you next time.